I had started doing it 6 years ago, and I was scared to share it with my followers because I thought they would just say, oh, you're just saying this to push a supplement. So I never did. I haven't even talked about this until years after I published on this topic. Being on a high animal protein diet can actually break down bone. In nature, there's an electrolyte that naturally occurs in meat and in the fluids, in blood. It's called bicarbonate. Once the animal dies, if you consume fresh meat, you're getting a decent amount of bicarbonate. After 6 hours, it's almost completely gone because post-mortem, the lactic acid starts building up due to the lack of blood flow. So the hydrogen ions will increase and it'll deplete the bicarbonate. So you're literally consuming a more acidic meat if you're consuming meat 6 hours after upon death. Nature put bicarbonate in there on purpose. When you acidify the interstitial fluid, all receptors interface the interstitial fluid. Receptors only function within a very narrow range of a pH. So you can potentially mess up the functioning of hormones if you are constantly acidifying the interstitial fluid. There have been studies proving that if you induce acidosis in someone, it will lead to insulin resistance. I care so much about my academic career and I publish in this space. And I hate when layman people try to say I'm wrong about acid-base balance because they've never published on it.
When it comes to salt, what are the myths you see, even to this day, people continue to perpetuate?
I think the biggest one is that we kind of think of salt as like a toxic poison versus an essential mineral. I think that gets lost in translation. So like most people, when they go to the doctor's office, if they have high blood pressure, the first thing their doctor tells them to do is you need to cut out the salt, like as if like there's no benefit to it, right? And I think that's like the biggest myth is that this is an essential mineral. We have to get some every day or we will die. And there's an optimal range. So you always get, with every mineral, there's either basically not enough, too much, or an optimal intake. And I think that has gotten lost in translation on what actually is an optimal intake. And for most people, that really sits somewhere between like 1.5 teaspoons to 2 teaspoons of salt per day. And essentially, that's what a lot of people are getting per day. But what a lot of people don't understand is you lose a lot of salt through sweat, through exercise, and through caffeine or coffee. So people think they're getting enough, but a lot of times they're actually being depleted by doing quote unquote healthy things, right? Drinking coffee, drinking tea, exercising, et cetera. So that I think is something that a lot of people are not basically, they haven't been told that really.
You mentioned the optimal range being up to 2 teaspoons, and then you gave different factors there that can deplete us. Is that 2 teaspoons on the higher end of that normal range? Does that count for some of those variables, such as caffeine and sweating?
Yes and no. Basically, what some of the balance studies have shown is that if you exercise rigorously, or let's say for like an hour per day, like pretty high intensity, like let's say cycling at 70% VO2 max, the balance studies show that you need 4,700 milligrams of sodium just to remain in positive balance, which is basically 2 teaspoons of salt. So you would need to go above that if you are exercising an hour plus per day.
And when we talk about that range, does that include the salt we're getting through food? I know certain foods like celery contain a lot of sodium. Actually, before we move into that, let's talk about salt, which is sodium chloride, versus just sodium. Let's parse the details out there.
Yeah, you're correct. So salt from a, let's say, weight basis is 60% chloride, 40% sodium. So if you ever want to kind of try to understand how much sodium is in salt, you divide the number by 2.5. So if someone's consuming 10 grams of salt, you divide that by 2.5, and that'll give you how much sodium. But it's made up of equal parts, when we're not talking about weight basis, of sodium and chloride. And most Americans, probably 80% of their salt intake is coming through processed foods. So that's why a lot of times you look at observational studies and they say, oh, people who eat more salt are at a higher risk of X, Y, and Z. But that's because salt tracks with processed food intake. So if you strip that away and you actually look at whole foods, they're not very high in salt because we no longer eat nose to tail where we're eating the salty blood, consuming the salty interstitial fluid anymore. We don't do that. So now you're just getting basically a plain piece of chicken and you're not getting the salty fluids with it. So that's why when you start eating healthy, you can really drop your sodium intake pretty quickly. You're also dropping your insulin levels too when you cut the carbs out. And so you start spilling more salt out in the urine. So all of a sudden you get like these keto flu symptoms where you're dizzy, you don't have a lot of energy. It's because you are low on salt. And so adding salt back to a healthy diet is typically necessary because whole foods are so low in salt.
And just to get really nuanced here, when salt is found in foods, is that sodium chloride or just sodium?
It's sodium and chloride. And the thing is like when you ingest it, it's going to turn into what's called an electrolyte. Basically, the sodium and the chloride are almost 100% absorbed. So most minerals kind of range in how well it gets absorbed. Like, calcium, magnesium, typically you're only getting a 30% absorption. Sodium and chloride have a very good absorption rate of about 99% for each one, or 90% plus. But they turn into electrolytes, charged particles. Sodium allows you to hydrate basically outside of the cell. So it gives you good blood circulation. It allows organs to perfuse well. It gives you a blood pressure, which you need, otherwise you would die. And it's required for the heart being able to beat, muscles to contract, right? The firing of neurons requires sodium. Chloride is used for creating hydrochloric acid, so we can actually digest food and absorb nutrients. And also our immune cells secrete something called hypochlorous acid, which also requires chloride. And you don't make those. You don't make sodium, you don't make chloride. You have to get it through diet. So these are two essential minerals contained in salt.
I think it's great we're getting into a lot of these details early on because it can be confusing when we look at salt and then sodium chloride being the formula for that. And then we have sodium. You mentioned it's a mineral. We talked about it being an electrolyte. There's all these different terms. And making sure we're all on the same page to start is just so important.
Agreed.
Okay, so what about in plant foods? You mentioned blood, eating the whole animal. I mentioned celery before. Is there a lot of salt in celery and other plants?
Certain plants, more aquatic plants, so like seaweeds, will have more sodium. Whereas like your land plants typically are much less. So terrestrial plants less, aquatic plants typically 10 times more sodium chloride.
I keep bringing up celery. Is that a good source of sodium?
I wouldn't say a good source, but yes, it has more sodium than what a typical plant food has.
Okay, so for somebody who this is all new information, we've talked about that range. And by the sounds of it, for most people, if they're eating a whole food diet, they're going to have to up their salt intake. If somebody goes above and beyond, how does the body deal with that? Is there a safety mechanism in place?
It's a great question. So if someone is insulin sensitive and they're not salt sensitive, which is what I mean by that is salt sensitivity is sort of there's a wide range to how you define it. But basically when you go from like a normal to a low amount of salt or a low to a high, somewhere between typically less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium on a low to somewhere between 3,000 milligrams or higher. If there's like a 3 to 5% increase in systolic blood pressure when you do that, you're considered salt sensitive, which salt sensitivity is really just a sign of insulin resistance, where you have elevated insulin levels causing you to over retain salt. So 80% of people with normal blood pressure are not salt sensitive. So the mechanism in place is your kidneys, where they can they filter 3.5 pounds of salt every single day. They're salt filtering machines. And there's been studies giving 100 grams of salt to individuals without high blood pressure. And there's no increases in blood pressure when they do that, because the kidneys are so good at basically getting rid of the excess salt in fluids. If you're someone who's insulin resistant, however, which is typically just because you're overeating refined carbs and sugar, so there's a fix to it. So basically don't blame salt for what the sugar did. Those individuals will see a significant increase in blood pressure when they increase their salt and fluid intake. However, if they simply reduce the refined carbs and sugars or increase their intake of potassium or magnesium, that typically fixes the salt sensitivity 9 out of 10 times.
Okay. If somebody is insulin resistant and they start upping the salt after listening to this, is there a threat of damage, say to the kidneys, by having that increased salt? You mentioned the fact blood pressure could go up. Hopefully, whoever's listening to this will become insulin sensitive again. And you mentioned somebody who is healthy in that realm can have, you mentioned 100 grams of salt, and they were fine. But somebody who isn't, because most of us these days, I think the percentage is 90 plus, aren't sensitive to insulin. Do they have to worry if they hear this and they start including more electrolytes that they're damaging, say, their kidneys or any other parts of the body as they're upping the salt intake?
Basically, most of those individuals are probably eating a normal amount of salt. So if they start adding to that without reducing the carb intake, they're going to see significant increases in blood volume, which is going to put pressure on the kidneys, the heart. They can start seeing like what's called pitting edema, ankle swelling, essentially fluid retention. So you always want to have a strategy where if you have insulin resistance, you do want to start cutting back on the carbs before you start just like increasing your salt and fluid intake, because in those instances, and it's going to be a wide range, those individuals will probably see a significant increase in blood volume. The other downside, even if you're, let's say, not salt sensitive, if you start essentially eating we don't exactly know how much, but if you start going above 2.5 teaspoons of salt, it can cause a slight low-grade acidosis when you start over-consuming salt. So even though 100 grams of salt hasn't been shown in a few studies in people who don't have high blood pressure to increase high blood pressure, you will still get this somewhat low-grade acidosis if you start over-consuming salt, which is, we don't know exactly, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 milligrams of sodium can lead to a fairly significant acidosis, where bicarbonate levels will start dropping and you'll start spilling more calcium out in the urine because of this acidosis. So even in people who are salt sensitive, you do need to be a little bit careful from that perspective of going over 6,000 milligrams of sodium per day, which is essentially closer to 2.5 teaspoons of salt. If you start going above that, even if you're not salt sensitive, you can start increasing the acid load in the body.
So it sounds like using this salt sensitivity and insulin resistance, one could be a proxy for the other.
Yeah. If you're like, man, am I insulin sensitive or not? A good proxy for that is if you go from a low amount of salt to a normal to high amount of salt and you see a significant rise in systolic blood pressure of 3 to 5%, that's indicative of insulin resistance.
One of the biggest things you'll hear when people talk about salt in the lay population is a lot of people have been told by a medical professional that they have to moderate their salt intake because of the blood pressure piece. And what you're saying here, just to be crystal clear on this piece, that somebody who is insulin resistant, which again, I want to caveat that most people in today's world are, that can affect blood pressure. Mm-hmm. But if somebody isn't insulin resistant, the blood pressure piece, we can take that off the table?
Yes. And the thing is too, is in those individuals that are basically, let's say you do get a reduction in blood pressure, if you are not volume overloaded, you're just volume depleting that person. So it may not even be a good reduction in blood pressure unless someone is volume overloaded. So when you increase potassium, that is a beneficial lowering of blood pressure. The arteries vasodilate, same with magnesium. But when you cut out salt, the blood pressure lowering may or may not actually be beneficial. If you are someone that has too much blood volume, then that drop in blood volume will be good. But if you're someone that has a normal blood volume and you drop salt intake and that drops their blood pressure, it may or may not be good, because that could just be volume depleting someone. You're essentially just dehydrating them. So all blood pressure lowering effects aren't the same. Some can be good, some can actually be bad. In a lot of studies, when you cut salt intake to very low amounts, like less than 1,000 milligrams of sodium per day, it can actually lead to acute kidney failure, because the blood volume drops so much and there's such a drop in blood flow feeding the kidneys, it leads to acute kidney failure. And I have a few references to that in the Salt Fix book. So you do need to be careful with just looking at blood pressure isn't always a good thing if it's dropping.
Let's take an example here. Somebody who is on a typical type diet, they're insulin resistant, they're having a lot of processed food, so they're getting a lot of salt in that food. they're going to transition to a lower carb animal-based diet, the diet you recommend. How do they do that in a healthy way so they can balance their salt as they're making that transition?
You want to slowly decrease the carbs. You don't want to all of a sudden go from 400 grams of carbohydrates per day to now less than 40, because you're going to just tank your insulin level. You're just going to really start spilling out salt, and you're going to really volume deplete that person. And so you got to be a little cautious. So I think a stepwise approach of somewhere around maybe 25% reduction in total carb intake for a week. And you do that every week until you get to your target goal of carbohydrates, which I think for the average person, somewhere between 50 and 150 grams of carbs is probably a good range. For most people, when you start going above 150 grams of carbohydrates, that typically is too much. Unless you are some type of like athlete that is exercising pretty vigorously every day, there's really no reason to go above like 150 grams of carbohydrates per day for an average person.
And for somebody that is overweight, insulin resistant right now, you mentioned that mid-range of carbs. Do you see value in temporarily, at least, really dropping those to lose that weight, regain metabolic flexibility and their metabolic health?
Yes, I do. I think for a lot of people, that initial 3-month period of maybe being less than 80 to 60 grams of carbohydrates. Some people don't even consume any. But I do feel that after a year or two, if you are below 50 grams of carbs, I personally have seen more anecdotes of more issues than benefit. So I feel like even with myself, even with Paul Saladino, even with, Carnivore Aurelius, et cetera, after 1 or 2 years, the energy levels, particularly during explosive exercise activity, doesn't seem to be as good when you are on basically a very low or no carb. So I'm talking like less than 50 grams of carbs per day. I definitely notice decreases in exercise performance, but some people don't. Some people really do well eating no carbs. So I think it's kind of like trial and error, where a subset of the population can actually be carnivore, and for some reason they thrive. Whereas another subset, like myself, and I have a more Mediterranean type of background. So like I would have had more exposure to fruits, than let's say someone of Northern European descent. Because I'm Italian and I have, some descendantry in Calabria, which is Southern Italy too. So my ancestors would have had much more access to fruits versus, let's say, someone, in Northern Europe. So I think honestly, genetics also plays a role in regards to who does well with like what type of carb intake.
I want to make sure I'm really clear on this piece. As somebody is transitioning to that lower carb, healthier whole food diet, because they're not going to get all that processed salt in the processed foods, and while their body's adjusting to this new way of eating, how would you supplement that diet as you're transitioning to that lower carb diet?
Yeah, essentially the first 1 to 2 days is like where you really see salt loss if you are going on a low carb diet. So if you cut your carb intake to less than 100 grams per day, essentially you need like an extra 1 to 2 grams of sodium for the next 1 to 2 days. So those are the most critical days. Then the next week, most people just need about an extra 500 milligrams of sodium to 1,000. It kind of depends on the person. In that if you get them through that first 1 to 2 weeks, making sure they're having a little bit of extra sodium or adding, a little bit of extra sodium, that seems to help a lot of people. So most people, when they're on that low carb diet, kind of tend to do better on the 4,000 to 5,000 milligram sodium range per day, sometimes even 6,000 if they're exercising a lot, because of that salt flush for the first 1 to 2 weeks.
We've been using sodium and salt back and forth. Are we using those interchangeably for our purposes?
When I say, let's say 5,000 milligrams of sodium, you would have to 2.5x that for total grams of salt. So that'd be like 12 grams of salt or something like that.
Got it. And let's talk salt quality. How do you feel about typical table salt? You go to a diner, you got your salt shaker there with the iodine in it typically, versus a sea salt and some of these more healthy, quote unquote, salts in our world.
Yeah. So to kind of level set, basically, you're never going to get a whole lot of other nutrients from salt besides sodium and chloride, except for rock salts will give you a fair amount of iodine. But beyond that, you're really not getting a ton of other minerals. Where I think some of the key benefits you can see is, I think everybody knows I'm a fan of Redmond Real Salt because it's from an ancient dried up ocean. So it will not have any of the pollutants from a modern day ocean because it's 700 feet below ground. And it's basically shielded from microplastics, etc. There's been a lot of like talk going around of heavy metals in certain salts, but nobody ever breaks down the actual amount. From the test that I've looked at, someone would need to consume about 10 teaspoons. When I say someone, actually, this is for pregnancy, which is a 10x safety factor compared to the general population. Someone would have to consume about 10 teaspoons of Redmond salt per day to hit the upper limit for a pregnant woman. You'd have to 10x that then for the general population because the pregnancy has a 10x safety factor. So in my opinion, there's huge fear mongering going around on salts, certain salts having high levels of heavy metals, but nobody actually states, well, how much would you have to consume to hit the upper level of intake? Nobody ever says that. They just say this is a high amount. And what they're doing too is they're using the amounts that are considered high in food. When you consume 2 to 3 pounds of food per day, but you only consume 10 grams of salt. So of course it may look high, but you have to look at the total amount being consumed, which is always going to be much, much smaller from salt versus food.
You mentioned iodine being in at least one of these, again, quote unquote, healthy salts. Was that the Redmond?
Redmond is one of them, yes. Yeah. According to their mineral analysis, 10 grams of their salt would have which about 4,000 milligrams of sodium would have about 170 micrograms of iodine, which is basically the RDA for most people.
And how does that compare to a table salt where they're adding that in after?
If it's an iodized salt, it'll probably be like half that amount. But most salts that aren't iodizing, like just regular sea salt, basically won't have any iodine in it.
Okay. So you mentioned the RDA there. If somebody is having their salt through a Redmond salt, are they getting enough iodine on a daily basis through that?
Well, it depends on the person, right? Because some people need more, etc. But according to the mineral analysis, if someone is consuming about 10 grams of Redmond salt, technically they would be hitting the RDA.
Okay, you mentioned the heavy metals that have come up in the salts. There's also caking agents, the iodine being added in. Are the caking agents and iodine in a typical table salt something you're concerned with?
I would prefer to consume a salt that doesn't have caking agents, that doesn't use bleach to turn the salt white, that doesn't use really high heat. So yes, if you can get like an unrefined salt like Redmond, I think that we don't know exactly what type of benefits that will lead to down the road, right? But I just think, why not? Why would you choose something that's bleached and refined versus not, right? It just doesn't make sense.
So when it comes to Redmond, they have their regular sea salt. They also have an electrolyte product.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm sponsored by Element and they have an electrolyte product. How do you look at salt from a quality company in the form of salt versus an electrolyte product? Is there any difference there?
So typically when you're looking at the higher salt electrolytes like Element and Relight, those are going to have different salts in it. So I think Element uses like a Utah salt, like from an actual lake, I believe, and Redmond's is just an underground salt. So Redmond's will just have more iodine, essentially, whereas Element won't. We do lose about 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of sweat, so that may or may not be advantageous if you're a heavy sweater. But if you're eating yogurt and cranberries, animal foods, you probably are getting enough iodine anyway in the diet. So
let's talk about hydration from a general perspective. Obviously, if somebody's exercising, sweating, going in the sauna, they're going to need more salt and electrolytes. But on a typical day, say you're not going to be doing anything strenuous, you're going to be working in the office. How do you start your day hydration-wise, including salt/electrolytes? And then when will you top that up throughout the day?
It's a good question. So we lose about 500 milligrams of sodium overnight in the urine. So you're waking up typically dehydrated. You haven't consumed any water or electrolytes typically in 8 hours. So I like to try to get 1 scoop of Relight, which is about 810 milligrams of sodium in about 10 ounces of fluid. And then I'll have another one if I do like a hard exercise, either before or after. So typically I'm having like 2 scoops of electrolytes where I'm getting about 1600 milligrams of sodium through Relight. And you can use Element too. Element's slightly higher in sodium. It's 1,000 milligrams for Element versus 800 with Redmond. And then probably I'm going to hit another 1,500 to 2,000 throughout the day, either salting my food or through the foods that I'm eating. So,
Okay. And if you don't exercise that day, the only electrolyte you'd take in would be in the morning?
yeah, typically if I'm not exercising that day, I'll probably just use one Relight. But I do tend to use their kids Relight because it's not as much sodium, but it just flavors the water better. There is some sodium, there is some potassium, magnesium. So I still will use one of the kids Relights if I don't work out.
And when it comes to hydration, are you drinking any pure water, like RO water, spring water, without any electrolytes or salt added?
Yes. So typically it's just twice a day where I'm consuming water with electrolytes, and then the rest is either through food, because whole foods are about 50% water. When you're eating fruits and vegetables, it's more like 80-90% water. And then, I typically drink Mountain Valley water. So, I might have like 1.5 to 2 liters of that per day.
And when it comes to this from a hydration perspective, how can we rely on our thirst? To you, is that something you look at, or you're doing it more scientifically based on the research you've looked at?
That's a great question. Typically, the body needs to become 1% dehydrated, maybe even more, sometimes 2%, for the thirst signal to kick in. So typically, by the time you are thirsty, you are already slightly dehydrated from a total body water perspective. So some people kind of get a little crazy and say you shouldn't be drinking when you're not thirsty. It kind of depends on the person. If you are always chasing thirst and you kind of seem to have like lulls in your energy, etc., then you may need to actually start consuming water and electrolytes before that thirst signal hits. Because like I said, by the time it hits, it's going to range, depending on the person, somewhere between 1% to 2% drop in total body water. So if you're that 2% person, you're probably not having the energy that you would have if you had consumed salt and electrolytes maybe 30 minutes to an hour before that thirst signal kicked in.
Let's take this to a performance aspect. Say you're going to do some kind of activity. We'll use running as an example. You're going to run 10K in the middle of the day, and you're working at home before that in the office, and you can work with electrolytes and hydration to best facilitate your performance on that run. What will you do leading up to it to make sure you're ideally hydrated and getting enough electrolytes?
It's a loaded question. So number one, depends on what you are doing. If you are just training and you want your performance to improve later on, or if you are in competition and you really want that race to be your fastest, best feeling race, 2 different strategies. When you are sort of just training, well, there's actually a third strategy. If you're just training and you want a good workout, typically somewhere between 800 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium with 10 to 14 ounces of water, 45 minutes before that activity, just so you feel good, you have a good training session. If you want to have dehydration acclimation, where you are volume depleting yourself, you're becoming mildly dehydrated, and then you're getting the acclimation benefits through that, then you don't really even hydrate prior to, let's say, running. So you're coming off that run, that 6.4 mile run, which is about a 10K, probably 2% dehydrated. You don't want to ever go to above 5%, but somewhere between 2 and 5% is not life-threatening. So you'll get all the blood volume expansion benefits. You'll get the increases in red blood cell benefits if you become dehydrated acclimated. And then for a race on competition day, if you're running, let's say we said a 10 kilometer, that's 6.4 miles. Let's say you do 6-minute miles. So that's like 36 minutes of running. I would probably do in that instance, it depends on also how hot it is that day, but I would say at least 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So 1 teaspoon of salt in about 20 ounces of water, starting 90 minutes beforehand. And you slowly consume that over 30 minutes. That gives you 60 minutes for that salt and fluid to absorb and expand blood volume. You can go up to 4,300 milligrams of sodium in a full liter of fluid, and that will really boost blood volume, like 8 to 10%. And that'll prevent the drops in blood volume that happen with, basically vigorous exercise.
Let's come back to the second scenario there, the hormetic benefit.
Yeah.
How often would somebody want to do that as part of their training in a week? And then give me the specifics of when they would introduce hydration again to not push it too far.
They would introduce it after the workout. So you don't preload with salt and fluids. You allow the body to become 2 to 5% dehydrated, and then you rehydrate back. So in that period, what's going to happen is basically aldosterone levels are going to increase when you become volume and salt depleted. So now you have this elevation in aldosterone, which is a salt retaining hormone. So what ends up happening now is the salt that you consume after that workout, you're going to absorb more of it and hold on to more of it, which will help expand baseline blood volume. So now the next time you run, you're going to perform better because your baseline blood volume has expanded due to the increase in aldosterone, but also there are increases in proteins too that will help you expand blood volume. So they've actually done studies looking at this. About a third of the benefit is from aldosterone, and 2/3 of the benefit is actually due to this improved oncotic pressure due to the basically more things like proteins that are holding on to more water as you become dehydrated, acclimated. So that's essentially how you would do it, is you would just rehydrate afterwards. If you want the benefits, of dehydration acclimation. How many times you would want to do that? The more times you do that, the more you will adapt and become better. So we have good data on this for sauna therapy, where if you do 4 sessions a week of sauna after exercise, like 30 minutes of sauna sessions 4 times a week for 3 weeks, a total of 12 to 13 sessions, you are essentially fully acclimated. So I would also assume that if you did that amount of sessions per week, total of 12 to 13 of dehydration acclimation through this not hydrating beforehand, that would also fully acclimate you.
For somebody, we can use the sauna example or exercise. We're putting the hormetic part aside for now. Any difference in rehydration after one of those? Say it's vigorous exercise and we're sweating a lot, losing a lot of electrolytes. Say over the next rest of that day, in either of those scenarios, how do we replenish ideally?
That's a good question. There are a total of about 10 minerals that are lost through sweat in a fairly significant amount. Obviously, sodium and chloride are the highest of those 10. However, remember how I said that sodium and chloride have really good bioavailability when you ingest them, but almost all other minerals do not. So take chromium, for example. Chromium's bioavailability in the diet is only 1%. So you lose typically, in the studies vary, but if you lose, let's say, 10 micrograms of chromium, you have to consume 1,000 micrograms to get those 10 micrograms back that you've lost. So if you start losing and sweating a lot, you should be replacing chromium. You should be replacing copper, because you do lose a fair amount of copper, and it ranges, but copper's bioavailability is only about 30%. So if you lose 1 microgram of copper, you may need 3 micrograms to get it back. I should have used milligrams. If you lose 1 milligram of copper, you may need 3 to get it back. So copper is another really important mineral we lose through sweat. So you need to be thinking about copper, zinc, iron, even calcium when it comes to hydration after you sweat, because what you lose, typically you need 3x intake to regain it back for all other minerals besides sodium and chloride.
And when it comes to that example and the loss of these different minerals, is there an easy way to get them in a good ratio afterwards? Because it's becoming quite complex for the average person quite quickly. Is there a certain supplement they can take to get those again in that ratio we want?
I would say so. Most people are going to be getting fairly good amounts of those minerals, except for chromium and copper. So I think supplementing with those two after you sweat, in addition to salt, I think makes a lot of sense. Chromium, copper. So probably somewhere between 100 to 500 micrograms of chromium and somewhere between like 1 and 3 milligrams of copper would probably be a good idea if you are sweating for an hour a day.
Okay, let's move away from the sweating, at least for now, and talk about diuretics. Somebody consuming caffeine, coffee in the morning, what is that doing in relation to electrolytes and hydration?
1 cup of coffee typically causes a 437 milligram extra loss of sodium. 2 cups is about 600. 4 cups is 1,200 milligrams of extra sodium loss, which is a half a teaspoon of salt. So you get the sodium loss occurring at just 1 cup of coffee before you even get the diuretic effect. So it's a natriuretic effect before a diuretic. You really don't see a significant diuretic effect of coffee until you consume 3 cups. Then you can actually start seeing significant losses in fluid volume out the body, where you could actually become dehydrated if you're only consuming, let's say, 2 liters of fluid, but 6 cups of that 2 liters is coming from coffee. You are now going to be about 7.7 liters of basically water deficiency. Like you are like in a deficient negative water balance because of the extra loss in water through the diuretic effect. So if you're consuming 3 cups of coffee in a fairly close proximity, let's say within an hour and a half, you probably want to bump up your water intake by 350 mLs. And you're going to want to increase your sodium intake by about 900 milligrams for 3 cups of coffee. So we do need to be thinking about salt loss. Tea will have about 1/4 the effect of coffee in regards to sodium losses out in the urine. Caffeine will also have a diuretic effect. And caffeine and coffee also cause you to lose sodium in water through extra sweat. So you'll have a 15% extra loss in sodium and chloride through sweat when you consume caffeine or coffee. And you also have a decrease in absorption. So coffee will decrease the absorption of salt, electrolytes, and water by about 20%, which is why it's important to hydrate first with salt and electrolytes 30 minutes before you have coffee. Otherwise, you're not getting the full benefits of the electrolytes. You're only getting 80% of the benefits, so to speak.
Okay, before you mention the fact that you start your day with the electrolytes, are you a coffee drinker?
I used to be. I'm off coffee except when I'm traveling. I still have some like tea. Like I do drink like this. I drink half day right now. It's just 50 milligrams of caffeine. I might have 2 a day. I find that I'm either I'm all in on coffee or not. So like if I'm drinking coffee, I'm drinking 4 cups a day. And so it's just too much of a salt loss. It decreases my energy and I'm constantly chasing the peaks, right? And then I'm having the troughs. So I do best actually really on no coffee.
Well, let's go through a typical morning at this point. You're off coffee right now. You're having your electrolytes. Walk me through the morning, different supplements, when you'll break your fast. What happens?
I will typically have 3 pasture-raised eggs, typically over easy. Then I'll break the egg yolks over 4 ounces of either grass-fed steak or something like that. Probably have like 2 or 3 ounces of grass-fed dairy for the calcium and to also reduce the absorption of the iron a bit. And then I'll probably also may or may not have a couple of ounces of freshly squeezed orange juice. So I try to have a decent protein, fat, in a good balance of nutrients for breakfast. Usually I'm more doing some type of workout for the day, either 30 minutes of basketball, a 2-mile run, maybe 5 or 10 hill sprints or flat sprints, something like that. And then I'll typically weight lift, for 4 to 6 times a week, something like that.
And what about fasting? Do you ever push that in the morning and do intermittent fasting?
So when I wasn't as active and I wasn't running, lifting, playing basketball, yes, I might skip breakfast because it's so easy. And I was drinking coffee back then too. Coffee is a great appetite suppressant. So just having a cup of coffee with maybe a tiny bit of cream, I could get away with doing that. Now I like to have a good breakfast because I'm so active. There's usually not a day where I'm not doing some type of pretty vigorous exercise activity.
Okay. What about supplements other than the electrolytes?
I always take my supplements after breakfast because I want to have the best absorption of the fat soluble nutrients like A, D, E, K, CoQ10, etc. But also too, I have a pretty sensitive stomach. So if I consume a lot of supplements on an empty stomach, I will feel nauseous. So I have the breakfast, then I'll go through and I typically have my IME, which is my daily ultimate essential. It's just the full spectrum vitamin mineral with CoQ10, MSM for joints, hair, skin, nails. And then I do take, a D3K2. I take a lutein zeaxanthin and astaxanthin combo for both eye health, heart health, skin health. So the carotenoids will get into all lipoproteins and protect them from oxidative stress, also the eyes and also the skin. So consuming lutein, zeaxanthin, astaxanthin are very important carotenoids, and they're fat soluble. I do take collagen, 2 types of collagen. So basically a powder and a type 2 collagen for joints. I take taurine. I take a separate MSM supplement too. I take eggshell membrane. I also take PQQ to boost NAD levels. What else? I do take a separate vitamin K supplement too, which has K1 and 2 forms of K2, MK4 and MK7. MK4 actually has more data than MK7, even though MK7 has a longer half-life. So I actually do like to get both forms of that in. I do take an omega-3 supplement too, because I no longer am a fan of eating fish. I used to be able to eat wild salmon, etc. I just don't like to eat it anymore. So I do supplement with fish oil. Sometimes I'll take krill oil or cod liver oil as well. I will take some glycine and taurine. Sometimes I'll do beta alanine if I can remember to take that for for athletic performance. I am taking right now a bone meal, like fish bones that have been pulverized into a powder for extra calcium. And that's about it. So I do take a lot. I obviously do take a lot of supplements.
Coming back to the collagen piece, do you look at that as being different than taking, say, a whey protein? Talk about the difference there.
Sure. It's a very commonly misunderstood substance. So a lot of people say, why do you need to take collagen? It'll just break down into amino acids. So just eat protein. They're forgetting 2 things. One, we absorb some of those collagen peptides intact, which will directly stimulate our cells to produce more collagen. So that's number 1. So whey protein will not give you the collagen peptides, dipeptides and tripeptides that will be absorbed intact that you will only get through consuming collagen. Number 2, just let's say a general whey protein is not high in the amino acids that are high in collagen, hydroxyproline and glycine in particular. So you need to get those because glycine makes up 1 out of every 3rd amino acid in type 1 collagen. And you're just not going to get a lot of glycine consuming just regular protein. So if you want the amino acids that actually support collagen growth, you have to consume the amino acids that are in collagen, not in whey protein, which would be glycine, hydroxyproline, and proline.
You've touched on different types of collagen. I know certain supplements out there are based on one source versus different parts of different animals to get different types. Talk about that and the importance of, for you, obviously, getting different types.
Yeah, so there's a total of 28 different types of collagen in the body. 95% of all of those is type 1, type 2, and type 3, with 90% of those being type 1. So can you get joint benefits by taking type 1, which is basically bovine hide? Yes. But type 2 is the type of collagen that primarily makes up our cartilage. So I do like to take type 2 as well, in addition to type 1 and type 3. So type 3 will also be in bovine hide, but it's much less of an amount compared to type 1. So type 1 is mostly your skin, your bones, your tendons and ligaments, whereas type 2 is your cartilage. So think more joints. But because typically supplements are much higher in type 1, you're getting like 10, 20 grams, whereas you're only getting like 1 gram of type 2, you can sometimes see better benefits on joints taking 10 to 20 grams of just the type 1 compared to 1 gram of type 2 because it's so much smaller. But if you start adding a little bit more of the type 2 plus eggshell membrane, you can start really seeing benefits on joint health.
Is there a good supplement out there that you can recommend where you get all the different types in a good ratio?
So I've built one to release through IMA because I'm actually the chief nutrition officer for IMA. So I build their products. So I'm building one right now, and that'll be released in 2026. But right now I take Ancient Nutrition, which has eggshell membrane, and it has 10 total types, but it doesn't have the type 2. So then I also take a type 2 capsule as well. So Ancient Nutrition is a good one. It's their multi-collagen one. And then a company called SFI has, and also BioCell, has the type 2 collagen as capsules.
But when this product comes out that you're helping develop, everything will be in one.
Everything will be in one, yeah.
For somebody who is using collagen as a post-workout supplement instead of a whey protein, so we're looking at this now from the other angle, talk about how that would be a good or not good choice as a replacement after the workout.
There's been at least 5 human clinical studies showing that if you add collagen to whey protein, you get more muscle protein synthesis, decrease in fat mass, basically increase in lean mass. Because muscle isn't just protein, it's also collagen, which a lot of people forget. Your muscle is actually made up of collagen as well. So combining both of those will actually not only improve muscle health and strength, but also tendons, ligaments. And that's typically where people see injuries, is the tendons and ligaments. Where whey protein isn't going to strengthen those, only collagen will strengthen those.
But what about for somebody that just uses collagen? They hear about how great collagen is, and they're using that as a post-workout protein source.
And then they are missing the benefits of adding whey protein or essential amino acids, because you still need those to help with muscle protein synthesis.
So at this point in your routine, you're not into intermittent fasting, but how do you feel about longer fasts? Having a day or multiple day fasts, say throughout a year, as part of your routine for different benefits such as autophagy?
I think it's real from the perspective of the studies on giving chemotherapy to people, where if you fast like 2 days before chemo, the turnover of your normal cells will decrease. So there'll be less chemotherapy uptake into healthy cells because now they're turning over slower, right? So cancer is a fast turning over cell. So chemotherapy will, basically try to target those, but you still get, your healthy cells still get damaged. So if you can decrease their turnover by fasting like 2 days beforehand, that has actually been shown to decrease the side effects. So you can actually go up on the dose of chemotherapy, especially if you do chemotherapy at night as well. So I think there's real benefits to prolonged fasting for that group. Whether or not, let's say 2, 3, 4 day fast every month or every 2 months has some type of true autophagy benefit, cleansing cells, it may. We just don't have those studies in humans yet. But I think that if you're only doing like a 2 or 3 day fast once every couple months, that's probably okay. But you can get into trouble if you do it too much, where you're decreasing lean muscle mass, losing minerals. You do lose salt and magnesium. You get a pretty significant acidosis after 24 hours of a fast because the ketone bodies are acidic, and there's a tremendous increase in ketone bodies when you fast. So that can cause more bone breakdown, losses of calcium and magnesium. So you don't want to be doing like a week fast every month. That's way too much. But if you can just keep it to 2 days, every 1 or 2 months, that's probably okay.
Let's extrapolate out on that ketone piece and the acidity. So somebody who is on a ketogenic diet, and it doesn't even have to be, every day, but say they're doing that during the week and then on weekends they introduce some carbs. Talk about the ketones from an acidity piece, if they're doing that the majority of the days being ketosis.
The ketones on a ketogenic diet will not lead to any type of significant acidosis. only fasting, prolonged fasting. However, there will be a significant acidosis if you are consuming a fair amount of animal protein. So I've published a couple of review papers on this topic. And so to kind of level set on how this happens, if you look at your urinary pH and it is 6 or less, which it will be on a high animal protein diet. My urinary pH is always about 5, which is 100 times more acidic than what it should be. A urinary pH of 7 versus 5 is 100 times more acidic. So what we need to understand, though, is that why is the urine more acidic when you are on a high animal protein diet? Actually, it's your kidneys producing more acid because when you consume animal protein, the liver oxidizes it to a sulfuric acid. So 2 hydrogen ions and a -2 sulfate. Those hydrogen ions then systemically circulate throughout the body, and about 80% of those will be neutralized by your own bicarbonate. So your bicarbonate will acutely drop, and you will acutely become more acidic for about 4 hours. This actually acidifies the interstitial fluid around the bone, and that will cause the osteoclast to break down bone. This has been shown in the Bellevue study, which was a year-long carnivore study, taking Stephenson and Anderson, who were Arctic explorers. It put them in significant negative calcium balance for a year. They had calcium balances measured out to 12 months. And it caused, in Anderson, 34,000 milligrams of calcium loss, which 32,000 could have only come from bone, because you only have about 2 grams of calcium that could actually be lost out of the body until you have to start taking calcium from bone, because 99% of our calcium stores are from bone. So they lost so much calcium in that year study. It sort of proved that actually being on a high animal protein diet can actually break down bone. But there's been dozens of other studies showing this too, looking at markers of bone breakdown and markers of bone formation. They go down on a high animal protein diet for bone building, and bone breakdown markers go up. This isn't to say that bone health can't improve on a carnivore diet going from a standard American diet. This is where it gets confusing. It's a slow, insidious loss of calcium out in the urine when you are eating a high animal protein diet. So it could take 10 or 20 years to actually see a decrease in bone mineral density based off of calcium. But if you are someone who is eating low protein, now you're eating a carnivore, you're eating high protein, low protein is worse than the low-grade acidosis of high protein. Let me be clear with that. So it's just that it's better to offset that acid load with like bicarbonate or fruits and vegetables, because you still lose a tremendous amount of calcium out in the urine. And there's been so many human clinical studies showing this. It's just nobody really has looked at this research or published it. So again, what happens is the liver releases the hydrogen ions. 80% are neutralized by your bicarbonate. Your kidneys are going to then reproduce all that bicarbonate to get your body back to that same level, because it fights to always keep bicarbonate at a normal level. But at the same time, it has to produce an equal amount of acid that comes out in the urine. So the acid that's coming out in the urine isn't actually what was released by the liver. That was neutralized by your own bicarbonate. But then your kidneys produce more bicarbonate to get it back up. And at the same time, they have to produce more acid, more hydrogen ions. That's where that acid is actually coming from. But it is directly reflective of the acid load that was released when you ate that bolus of protein. So you can't look at blood pH, because it's only going to go down slightly. Like, you're going to stay in the normal range. But what people need to understand is the normal range is 2 standard deviations away from normal. Like, most normal people are already acidic. You don't want to be 2 standard deviations away. So if you are on the lower end of normal on a bicarb or a pH, that's not good. You are likely low. You likely have low-grade acidosis. But if you just look at your urinary pH, a urinary pH of 6 or less, you definitely have low-grade acidosis for those 4 hours within when you tested it.
Okay, let's come back to you. You mentioned the fact that you are slightly acidic or significantly. Yes. You mentioned something in the range of 5 or 5 point something. Okay, significantly. And we know you're eating a lot of animal products.
Yes.
So for somebody saying, okay, what you just shared, would allude to the fact that you're doing something detrimental to your health. So given all that, what do you do to buffer the fact that you are more acidic?
Yeah, so let's take a step back too. So in nature, there's an electrolyte that naturally occurs in meat and in the fluids, in blood. It's called bicarbonate. Once the animal dies, if you consume fresh meat, you're getting a decent amount of bicarbonate in fresh fluids. After 6 hours, it's almost completely gone because post-mortem, the lactic acid starts building up, right, due to the lack of blood flow. So the hydrogen ions will increase and it'll deplete the bicarbonate. So you're literally consuming a more acidic meat and more acidic fluids if you're consuming meat 6 hours or after upon death. So we used to consume fresh meat and fresh fluids at least some of the time. So nature put bicarbonate in there on purpose. And a lot of people will kind of make fun of people and say, there's no such thing as an alkaline diet and you can't alkalinize the body. Well, we are actually alkaline. First of all, our blood pH is 7.4. And that's so let me also take a step back here. pH of water is 7 at a room temperature of 77, okay? But temperature also affects pH. So in our bodies at a 98.6, a pH 7 water is actually a pH of 6.8. So for our blood to be 7.4 goes to show you we are more alkaline than water would be at that level. So we keep our bodies more alkaline. So if you eat a fresh mammal, is what I'm trying to say, if you eat an elephant, you're eating something that's alkaline. It is more alkaline than acidic. So yes, there is something called, there is a real alkaline diet that is consuming fresh animals. They're alkaline, they're not acidic until 6 hours or after death. Now it is more acidic. So I think that's important to understand. So I take bicarbonate to offset it. Basically, I take, it's about, let me run the numbers here. I do about 1.2, 1.3 grams of sodium/potassium bicarbonate for every 7 ounces of animal foods that I consume. That will essentially neutralize the acid load.
Okay. And in layman's terms, that's just baking soda, correct?
Baking soda is just sodium bicarbonate.
Right.
Yeah, I take a blend of sodium and potassium. Yeah.
And when will you take that? Say you're, firing up the barbecue, you're about to have a steak. Are you doing it beforehand, during, after?
For the first week, I think it's kind of good to take it like maybe 45 minutes beforehand because you do get a little bit more burping until you get used to it. But then afterwards, think about it. It was always in the meat. We would always consume bicarbonate with meat. So I like to take it right actually with my meal because my meal reminds me to take it. And also, your body's really smart. It will instantly increase the production of acid to make sure that everything in the stomach gets fully digested. So a lot of people will be like, I don't want to take bicarbonate with my meal. It's going to prevent me from digesting my food well. That doesn't happen at all. The animal studies they've looked at animal studies and they've shown that when they give the animals bicarbonate and they can directly measure the stomach acid and the gastric juice production, et cetera, there's no change because the body is smart and it just compensates for that. And how exogenous bicarbonate alkalinizes you isn't just that you absorb the bicarbonate. What ends up happening is, remember how I said when you're excreting acid, it's actually from us producing bicarbonate and then also acid. When you take exogenous bicarbonate and you deplete your acid level, your stomach's going to then get that acid level back up. But at the same time, it has to produce an equal amount of bicarbonate. That's how you become alkaline. Taking exogenous bicarbonate is your body is making more as it's producing more acid to offset the little bit of depletion that you gave it. It's called the alkaline tide. So a lot of people try to say that I was wrong by saying, oh, well, when the bicarb hits the acid, you'll just burp it out. They don't understand the alkaline tide. So I've had many people try to counter me. I've yet to see a single person that's actually published on the topic like I have. And I've yet to see a single person ever come at any of the clinical studies that I've shown to disprove what I'm saying is wrong. And the reason why I get a little defensive is because I care so much about my academic career and I publish in this space. And I hate when layman people try to say I'm wrong about acid-base balance because they've never published on it. And so I'm super passionate about that, which is why you can see it, why I'm getting a little bit, because I've had some people come at me that are considered really smart in this space, and a lot of people have kind of taken their side thinking they're right. But trust me when I say that the clinical evidence in humans definitely proves me correct.
When it comes to what you just shared, this is primarily all new for me in preparing for this interview. And I just want to dig into the nuance here like we are to fully understand it. It's not something I've considered before. I've heard meat is acidic. People, it might be more plant-based people say meat's acidic for the body, but don't give the justification like you just have. So in coming into this conversation, I want to make sure we got into this. And I'm coming in with an open mind. I just want to understand and push back on different areas to make sure you get the story out there and I can fully understand.
Yeah. Part of it is that people will say, well, the blood pH doesn't go very low. But hey, when you're magnesium deficient, you can have a normal blood level. That doesn't mean the body isn't deficient in magnesium. And same thing with acidosis. A lot of the acidosis is occurring in the interstitial fluid, which we're not measuring. It's funny too, this one carnivore came at me and he did it publicly so I can mention who it was. He follows me and we're friendly, but his name's Carnivore JT. And he, did a video saying, look at all my blood levels, et cetera, are fine. His CO2 was 23, which a bicarb is 95% of CO2, which means his bicarb was less than 22, which is clinically low. In other words, he proved to the world that he essentially has low-grade acidosis, but he thought he was about to prove me wrong, but he didn't. He ended up proving me right, which is kind of funny if you ask me. So you can look at your CO2 levels too, multiply it by 95%. That'll tell you what your bicarb is. Typically, it wouldn't be low, though. It shouldn't be low. Like, to go outside of the normal range, you are really acidic. That should not happen. So if you have a CO2 of 23 and a bicarb less than 22, holy cow, you are consuming a ton of animal protein to do that. And, his post clearly showed that, which I thought was kind of funny.
This world is something I've been in for a long time, and I've dug deep, given what I do, week in, week out, day in, day out, into this. And I haven't heard anybody else get into this with near the detail that you're bringing to the conversation. Is there anybody else talking about this? And if not, why not?
It's a great question. So I have a pinned tweet that goes over a lot of the studies, and I included Sean Baker, I included Ken Berry, who I kind of consider friends. I've done podcasts with both of them numerous times. So I don't name myself Carnivore James DiNic, right? Because you do that, now you're locked in, right? Like, these people don't want to change their hashtags or whatever you want to call it, right? Their names now, because they're really all in on this. And so they've been promoting carnivore for so many years, they don't want to see anything negative. I mean, for the longest time, I didn't want to believe it either. So, but I don't form to any type of group, or I don't have any type of skin in the game. I just want to know what's healthy, what's real, what's not. Even Anthony Chaffee, I asked him, hey, do you want to discuss this topic on your podcast? Because we were going back and forth a little bit friendly. And I saw that he saw it. It says seen. My message, never responded back to me. So he doesn't want to Richard Smith, who me and him actually had a battle with, he's actually willing to bring me on to discuss this. So very, very few people are going to be willing to discuss it because it flies in the face of like what they've been promoting, because it brings up a negative side effect of animal protein. And I'm animal based. I don't even want to admit that there's a negative side to overeating animal protein, but just like you can overeat carbs, just like you can overeat fat, you can overeat animal protein.
You've mentioned a bunch of previous guests of the show, including Anthony Chaffee. I'd love to do a friendly debate with him or one of the other people you mentioned if they're interested on the show. So I'll publicly put that out there if you're open to that.
I mean, you can, but if he didn't even respond to me, like in a friendly just discussion, me and him, I doubt he's going to want to debate me. You know what I mean? Because I would have just friendly discussed it on his own podcast. Whether he would actually want to debate with me, I highly doubt it. You can. I just don't like coming off like that. Like, oh, let's debate. Like, who's right, who's wrong? Because then people get defensive and then they don't have an open mind. I came to him and wanted to just come as a guest, because typically when you come as a guest, you're going to have at least somewhat of an open mind. When you're debating someone, your defenses are already up. You're going to never give in. And he's done a few videos before even understanding how meat could cause an acid load, which is, it's understandable. If you haven't published on this topic, you're not going to really understand how the heck can meat bring an acid load. But it's because meat is 2 to 5 times higher in sulfur-containing amino acids called methionine and cysteine. And when our liver oxidizes cysteine, it releases sulfuric acid. And so that's where you get the 2 hydrogen ions, which makes the body more acidic, and also a -2 sulfate when that happens. And you form sulfuric acid, and then that dissociates very quickly to the hydrogen ions and the sulfate. So there's that. And there's also a potential downside on if you have healthy kidneys and good renal reserve. When you consume a very high bolus of animal protein, you will hyperfilter because of the spike in amino acids, the spike in urea, and also the acid load, where your GFR can go up by 50%. And that's been shown in a few studies to actually more than double albumin in the urine of young individuals, like 24-year-old men who can really hyperfilter. You give them a large animal protein load, they can start spilling more than twice the albumin in their urine. You won't see that with an older person who can't hyperfilter as well. But there is potential that high animal protein intakes, not offset with bicarbonate, can actually damage the kidneys. We need more data. We only have out to 1 week studies. But I don't like to see studies showing more than doubling of albumin in younger individuals over consuming animal protein.
I believe you touched on this, but I want to go deeper into it. How long of a time frame are we looking at? Because I'm sure you'd agree, there's a lot of people in the carnivore world that are subjectively at least thriving for whatever period of time. So given all you shared there about the science and what goes on with the physiology, how long does that take to play itself out before somebody is going to notice their health tanking?
We don't 100% know. If I were to sit here and say, 10 years, I'd be lying, because we only have a carnivore study out for 12 months. So I can technically only speak to that long of a period of time. But based on the 12 months and negative calcium balance, somewhere between, I would say 10 and 20 years, where it would be realistic to see a drop in calcium levels that you could clinically see on a bone mineral density scan as being low. Now, the caveat though is when you start eating more animal protein, you start lifting more weights, you can start actually building bone mineral density compared to someone who's eating a low amount of protein on a standard American diet. So you can see bone mineral density improve on a carnivore diet. How long it would take to actually offset those gains based on calcium losses, again, could be 20 or 30 years. And that's only if you're consuming what Anderson and Stephenson consumed, which was just muscle meat, some of the associated fat, and organs. If you're smart enough to consume some dairy, then you're not going to have as much of an issue. So there's been carnivores that have been on carnivore for 60 years, but they also drink raw milk. And apparently there doesn't seem to be any real issues in regards to at least like fragility fractures or anything like that. So you can offset it. It's not like if you're on a carnivore diet, it's 100% going to be bad. If you're eating a muscle meat carnivore diet that does not provide enough calcium, you will go into negative calcium balance for at a minimum of 1 year. And at the 1 year mark, Anderson and Stephenson were still losing about 175 milligrams of calcium out of their body every single day. So I don't see that really tapering off to very minimal amounts until at least another year. But if it hasn't shut off we shut off sodium losses within 1 or 2 weeks. So for the calcium losses to not shut off after a year tells me that it's not something that our bodies actually have the ability to just quickly shut off. That, in my opinion, it would continue to happen if you keep eating a large animal protein load.
So you mentioned early on in this piece that if we were to eat the animal fresh within 6 hours of kill,
yes,
what we're talking about here would be not of concern.
Yeah, not of a concern. You would just get some bicarbonate. So you would get about if you consumed it. So basically, most animals consume an animal even before it's dead. They're eating it alive. Lions will suffocate it first, but then they're eating it right away. You're going to get about 1,000 milligrams of bicarb per kilogram of meat if you consume it right away. That won't fully offset the acid load, but that will significantly reduce it, because remember I said I consume about 1.3 grams of sodium/potassium bicarbonate, which isn't all, it's like 80% bicarbonate. So that I consume about a gram for 7 ounces, but you only get a gram per kilogram of meat, which is 2.2 pounds. So it's not fully offsetting, but you're offsetting some of that. Another good example of kind of supports the acidosis theory is there's been studies looking at the Inuit born in the late 1800s and early 1900s and looking at their bone density. Now, you kind of got to look at women, because even men that consume a standard American diet, their bone density never even gets low enough to have a spontaneous fracture. It just doesn't happen in men. In women, at 75 though, it typically does. The Inuit, they were having fractures and osteoporosis a full decade before Caucasians on a standard American diet. So the Inuit had worse bone health in regards to, even looking at the ancient extinct Inuit, had a ton of vertebral compression fractures. So we know through bone studies on basically the Inuit that went extinct, but also bone mineral density scans on Inuit eating a traditional Inuit diet that were born late 1800s, early 1900s, that they have worse osteoporosis and worse bone mineral density. So that also further supports from a population standpoint as well, that yes, this acidosis can actually contribute to osteoporosis in women. It's not as big. So like Sean Baker, Sean Baker, he's a huge guy. He's like 6'5", 250 pounds with pure muscle. His peak bone mineral density and bone mass is way more than your typical average man. So I wouldn't even really expect to see much of an issue for him when a normal standard American person, male, never even reaches a bone mineral density to have a spontaneous fracture. So Sean Baker isn't going to be having that when he's doing box jumps, right? And building his bone density, doing all those other things. So again, there's things you can do to offset the bone mineral density loss, but I still think when you acidify the interstitial fluid, all receptors interface the interstitial fluid, thyroid receptors, insulin receptors, think of any receptor. Receptors only function within a very narrow range of a pH. So you can potentially mess up the functioning of hormones if you're constantly acidifying the interstitial fluid. And there have been studies proving that if you induce acidosis in someone, it will lead to insulin resistance. So it's just, I think from a perspective of optimal health, taking some bicarbonate with animal protein is going to have a lot of benefits, to be fair.
A couple of other variables you brought in, I want to bring back in: exercise and drinking dairy, or consuming dairy, sorry. Do you think if those were done strategically within a carnivore diet that included dairy, obviously, that somebody could nullify what you're talking about here?
It would nullify the negative calcium balance if they are consuming enough calcium from that product. Hard cheeses are very acidic. So Parmesan cheese will bring the highest acid load into the body, whereas milk and yogurt has a neutral effect, or actually might even be slightly alkaline. So if you're consuming raw milk or you're consuming yogurt, that is actually going to potentially somewhat neutralize some of the acid, but not fully, not even close. But you're also going to get good calcium. But you still aren't inhibiting the acidosis occurring in the interstitial fluid. And so you're breaking down the bone, but at least you have the calcium now to kind of regain it back then, right? So like you're stripping it, but then you're hopefully having enough calcium to kind of rebuild it again. Then you're stripping it again. So maybe you don't actually go down in bone health. But if you're not taking bicarbonate, you're still not going to offset the low-grade acidosis and all the potential harms that could happen from a receptor perspective, from a pain perspective. A lot of people have joint pain because of the interstitial acidosis too. There's been studies giving alkaline minerals, and that reduces back pain and joint pain as well.
You mentioned the fact that when you're buffering this, you take a product that has the baking soda, and I think it was a form of potassium. What is that specifically? Like, is there a brand name that people can get?
Yeah, I think it's made by SFI. It's called bicarb formula, bicarb formula. And it's sodium and potassium bicarbonate. And there's been so many randomized studies giving sodium or potassium bicarbonate or citrate, because citrate turns into bicarbonate in the body, to people with osteoporosis or kidney disease. And it literally improves bone mineral density, improves bone mass, improves kidney health. So you can quickly see benefits in people with kidney dysfunction or poor bone health when you give bicarbonate or citrate. So that's another testament to why I think we should be taking these supplements.
And when it comes to this acidity, does it differ between different kinds of meat? Red meat, chicken, fish? Talk about the differences there.
Fish is more acidic, will bring a higher acid load. Processed meats will bring an even higher acid load. And egg yolks, because of the sulfur, that's where most of the hydrogen ions are coming from, the sulfuric acid. So anything high in sulfur, which is really your hard cheeses and your eggs, are a big acid load. So you got to also, that's a great question. You're asking really good. I've never ever been interviewed by someone that's asked this many good questions. Hard cheeses and eggs are the most acidic, quote unquote. Then your processed meats, then grains. And then after that, you can bring alkalinity into the body. So you can offset the acid load of animal foods with low oxalate fruits and vegetables, because the oxalates will prevent the basically citrate from being released and turning into bicarbonate in the fruits and vegetables. So it has to be low oxalate fruits and vegetables. But you have to consume 2 to 3 times the amount of those to fully offset the acid load of animal foods. I don't do that because I'm 80-85% animal based. That's why I supplement with sodium and potassium bicarbonate.
Okay. And you mentioned 7 ounces being, you gave a certain ratio there of bicarbonate that you take when you have that much meat. If you're having smaller amounts of meat, do you worry about it? What I'm getting at here is anytime you're consuming something acidic, you got into the egg yolks and the cheese, are you always doing this? Or just if you're having a big bolus of acidic food?
So I'm always doing it because there's never going to be a meal where I'm eating less than 5 ounces total of animal foods. And really, I would say somewhere around 4 ounces or more is probably enough of a load to lead to a fairly significant acid load in the body. So, and of course it will depend, right? If it's 4 ounces of eggs, that's a much higher acid load than 4 ounces of steak. But typically I'm probably having somewhere around 7 to 8 ounces of animal foods per meal, which is definitely enough to need to be offset by sodium and potassium bicarbonate. But the best way to do it is just look at your urinary pH. If it's 6 or less, that's a significant acid load within 4 hours of that measurement.
What about kids? I believe you have children. Is this something you do with them?
No, I don't. Because again, I think I don't know why I don't. I've never thought about doing that. Honestly, if it was up to me, I probably would, but my wife wouldn't probably allow me to spike their yogurt or whatever with bicarbonate, but I could. They really don't eat that much animal protein, right? Like kids, it'll probably take them till 14 years old till they're really eating like a 8-ounce burger, right? Like my son barely finishes 3 ounces of meat right now at a time, but he is smaller, so like 3 ounces is actually more equivalent to 6. But for an optimal health perspective, should I be doing it? Probably. Am I doing it? No. I worry more about women in particular are much more at risk from this, as we discussed. And I think it's more decades of doing this over and over again where it becomes an issue.
So is your wife on board?
She doesn't eat actually a ton of animal protein. She eats a lot different than me. She eats much less in a sitting than me. So I honestly, she doesn't like all this science stuff, so I don't really talk to her about it. If I can get her to take a couple supplements, I'm happy.
And when did you come across this science? And how long have you been buffering your acidic diet?
Yeah, I published a couple of review papers on this in 2021, and probably started researching it 10 years ago. So I've been taking citrate and bicarbonate on and off for probably 6 years or so. I was on citrate for probably a year and a half, and after a while, it actually started kind of hurting my stomach a little bit because citrate crystals they're more like crystals than powder, and it can kind of irritate the stomach a little bit if you don't take it with a good enough amount of carbohydrates. So bicarbonate, I've never had a problem, so I'm on bicarbonate now. So I've been really good at buffering the last couple of years, but I had started doing it like 6 years ago, and I was scared to share it with my followers because I thought they would just say, "Oh, you're just saying this to push a supplement." So I never did. I haven't even talked about this until maybe 6 to 10 months ago. Years after I've even published on this topic, because I thought that people would just say I'm doing this to promote a supplement. But people need to understand it's literally just an electrolyte that's naturally contained in fresh meat. And once they actually start understanding it, and I've done diagrams of actually how much bicarbonate is contained in a full adult elephant, there's over 200 million milligrams of bicarbonate or bicarbonate forming substances in an adult elephant, in the blood, in the interstitial fluid, in the meat, and then mostly in the bone. There is a lot of basically carbonate, which will turn into bicarbonate in the bone. And there's also a lot of basically acid buffering substances like phosphate in the bone. So when we were hunter-gatherers, when we were kind of gnawing on the bone, and we were also getting bicarbonate forming substances that way too.
Okay, just to be clear on this piece, fresh animals still contain the bicarbonate. It sounds like if you're eating bones, or maybe we could extrapolate that into making bone broth, how does that fit into all this?
If you're eating bone, then you would be getting some carbonate, and you would be offsetting some of that acid load. How much would depend on how much you're consuming. Most people don't consume bone meal though. So, but that is one potential way to somewhat offset it. I don't think realistically someone's going to be consuming enough bone meal to fully offset the acid load from a high animal protein diet. But I think, yes, you're doing it a little bit.
You mentioned earlier that you consume bone meal. Is that for this purpose?
No, more the calcium, because calcium's kind of got a bad rap, but like calcium's like one of the biggest missing nutrients in a carnivore diet. Like if you're consuming 1.5 pounds of muscle meat, you're only getting 100 milligrams of calcium. I don't care who you are, you're going to be in negative balance. You gotta be consuming at least, from a physiological standpoint, like of what's even physiologically possible to remain positive balance, 150 milligrams of calcium. But realistically, you should be trying to hit at a minimum 400 milligrams of calcium, and ideally more 600. So I try to hit 500 milligrams of calcium per day, and bone meal helps get me there a little bit. But I may have some calcium, and I make sure to get 6 ounces of grass-fed yogurt every single day.
So we talked about the bone piece. What about organs when it comes to calcium and this buffering? Do they fit in?
They won't have calcium to help, and obviously from like an acid production, that's not good either. Like, it's not super high in protein, but it's not going to help, right? It's not like it's has bicarbonate in it. I think a lot of people are lacking in copper. I think some liver once a week or a copper supplement. A lot of people hate on copper supplements because they view it somewhat like oxidative reactive, but all the clinical studies I've looked at looking at copper supplementation has shown decreased oxidative stress, improvements in blood pressure, probably because so many people are deficient in it. So I would rather get copper and risk the quote unquote oxidative stress by taking a copper supplement, or ideally consume some liver, like an ounce of liver every 3 days or something like that. It's like, it doesn't have to be much.
What do you do personally when it comes to organs? How do you consume them?
So I used to be better. North Star Bison has these blends, which are nice. You don't really taste a lot of the liver. So they have old world blends, which is like 80% muscle meat, 20% organs. Getting the blends are the easiest, and then just making like burgers out of those. I have to be better though. I definitely don't consume them enough. I should, but I do take a couple supplements that has the copper in it. But still, I would prefer to use the organ. So I do have to be better about that.
Earlier, when you brought up produce, you brought up oxalates specifically and avoiding those. How do you feel about other plant toxins? Things like phytates, lectins, or are oxalates the primary focus for you?
I think oxalates, in my opinion, have the most potential for harm. Phytate, I think, is a balance. I think phytate has anti-cancer properties, but it also can somewhat inhibit nutrient absorption. So it's like, to me, that's more of a double-edged sword, where oxalates, I don't see any benefits of consuming oxalates. So worst offender to me would be oxalates. After that, lectins, this or that, I don't know. I think the research is a little sketchy on that. I have to admit, though, I have not really done a deep dive on plant toxins. So I'll just stick to the ones that I kind of have looked at, being oxalates and phytates. And I view phytates much more beneficial and less harmful than oxalates.
What about seed oils? This is something that's really coming into our world in a big way. There's, a couple people saying that they're fine, maybe even healthy. Most people are saying avoid them like the plague. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
So most seed oils, if they're not like organic, cold pressed, are going to already be oxidized because it takes high heat and hexane to extract them. So in my opinion, why would you want to consume an oil that already is oxidized? And then it will further oxidize in the acidity of the stomach and form hydroperoxides and aldehydes, which is carcinogenic. And probably too, at the level of what we're consuming, is actually probably carcinogenic, because there's been human clinical studies showing it just missed statistical significance. It was Dayton et al. It was a 7-year study on, animal foods versus, more omega-6. And the p-value was 0.06. It just missed statistical significance for significantly increasing cancer in humans, basically swapping animal foods for seed oils. Chris Ramsden, who's from NIH, has done a couple meta-analyses on the randomized control trials looking at this, showing significant increases in all-cause mortality with seed oils compared to a combination of trans fat and saturated fat. So I think most seed oils, especially when you cook them, are harmful, and I just don't see any reason why to consume them.
Well, conventional wisdom, conventional medicine would push them at people as a way to lower LDL, which they do. Doesn't mean they're good. There's a whole continuum of people in our world that say LDL is bad, is something we don't need to worry about it, but it's not good. And then people that even say it's good. Where do you fall on that continuum?
Yeah, so people that are trying to say LDL is good, I think is foolish, from the fact that cancer and inflammation drops LDL. That's why low LDL is associated with a higher amount of mortality, because interleukin-6 and all the inflammatory cytokines will drop LDL. When you have a heart attack, that drops LDL. So it's not like low LDL is harmful. It's reverse causation. The harmful things are dropping LDL, and that's why low LDL is associated with bad outcomes, because cancer inflammation drops LDL. But a lot of people are, using that to say low LDL is bad. I don't like that. I don't like when people do that in our space, because it just makes us look foolish. On the other hand, I don't think LDL per se is inherently harmful. I think because most plaque is where you have the turbulent flow, right? Like in the arteries. So it's more than just LDL. If it was LDL as the cause, it would be across all the, the arterioles. It wouldn't just be in certain spots, right? So there's the turbulent flow and the shear stress damaging the endothelium, plus you have it's not, I don't think our lipoproteins are being produced to harm us. That's what I'm trying to say, is like, they're not inherently harmful. But when you consume omega-6 seed oils, all the lipoproteins become saturated in more omega-6. And many studies have shown that LDL, that VLDL, that HDL that is more saturated in omega-6 is more susceptible to oxidation. So I think the susceptibility of your lipoproteins to oxidation is much more important than the overall level of LDL. And you can get into the nuances of small dense being worse than large buoyant, but in my opinion, how much omega-6 is in your lipoproteins and how susceptible they are to oxidation is more important than even small dense versus large buoyant.
We've spent a lot of the conversation to this point talking about salt, talking about foods. When it comes to your health and your healthy lifestyle, what other modalities do you like to include? Things like saunas, cold plunge, we could call them hacks. What do you do on a regular basis?
Walking, getting outside, getting sunlight, 20 minutes a day, I think is important. I think finding like a sport that you enjoy, whether it's basketball, like try to make movement fun. I think a combination of high intensity training, interval sprints plus walking, I think is good, and weightlifting. You also want to add in at least 3 days a week of some type of resistance training, whether it's body weight exercises, resistant bands, whether it's, weights, free weights, or machines. And you typically want to hit each muscle group twice a week. So biceps twice a week, back twice a week. I like to do push-pull, meaning I like to do biceps and triceps on one day and back and chest on another, because when you're doing back, you're also using your biceps. So by the time I'm done doing back, my biceps is going to suffer, or vice versa. So I like to do push-pull on one day, which would be bicep, tricep one day, and then back and chest on another day. And then integrating neck, legs, core, etc., shoulders. So exercise to me is always key, and walking is always key. Sauna, yes, I do think that's important, but at the same time, you're also depleting your electrolytes. I think exercise, in my opinion, is more important than sauna. But if you can't exercise, sauna is great because it sort of mimics exercise to an extent from the increase in heart rate, et cetera. But in the summer, I typically don't even go in the sauna. I just I play hard enough to where it's almost kind of creating a sauna session when I play basketball outside. So,
anything else? Any other, red light, things you do for sleep to hack your sleep? Certain supplements. There's a lot of supplements coming into the world. Methylene blue, different biohacks for the brain.
My neighbors make fun of me because by the time it's 7 p.m, my house is so dark. They're like, what is going on? But I try to keep the lights either off or to very minimum at night, because light at night will prevent the release of melatonin and delay it. So it'll be a decreased release and it'll delay the release. So it'll really mess up your sleep. Also, light at night can potentially increase cancer as well. And then also trying to get morning sunlight, just walking outside for 10 minutes will help set your circadian rhythms to where you will secrete melatonin earlier and more profoundly if you get light in the morning. So just trying to match the day night cycles will help with sleep. And inositol is probably one of the best supplements that has helped my patients with sleep. Basically just even, it helped my sleep a lot too. I was dissolving 3 grams of inositol twice a day. It gave me energy during the day, but then I slept really good at night. Magnesium glycinate can help with sleep too. Same with theanine, and also glycine about an hour before bed helps to cool down core body temperature. So either keeping your room cool, it's always dark, and I like to have a fan on my feet to help cool my body off, because our core body temperature actually has to drop about 2 degrees for us to actually be able to fall asleep. So I think that's a big one. A lot of people are sleeping in too hot of a room and they're not able to fall asleep. So having a cool room will help people fall asleep and stay asleep better.
Another supplement I've heard you talk about for the mental and physical is creatine. Is that something you're currently taking?
So creatine, your needs are going to be totally different. I do eat a fair amount of red meat, so I don't need as much. But if you're consuming well-done meat, you're not getting as much creatine. So I try to consume just medium meat instead of medium well or well, because you do lose the creatine as you overcook the meat. So I might only need like 2 grams, or someone who's not consuming like 1.5 pounds of red meat a day, they're going to need, 3 more grams in that, or about 5 grams. So it just depends on your diet and how much you're overcooking your red meat or not.
Have you looked at any of this research, taking more creatine, higher doses for sleep deprivation?
Yeah, there like 20 to 30 grams has been shown to help, recover from sleep deprivation. And a lot of people are starting to take 10 grams of creatine to increase brain creatine levels even more, which it does do that. And it may even increase skeletal muscle creatine as well. I just don't know if we have the safety data going to 10 on kidney function. We have 3 to 5. You're kind of just playing in a world of where we don't have good science. And when you start playing in those pools, you're taking the risks too. So that's all. If you start going above at the 10 to 20, 30 grams, I don't know for, decades what that could potentially do.
All right, Dr. James, really enjoyed the conversation. We're going to leave it there for today. You got a lot of books. We're going to link them up in the show notes, your social media, your website. Thank you for this. Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
Eating an ultra-processed food diet, especially full of seed oils for a long period of time, really can mess up physiology. It basically changes the mitochondria in a way that you cannot effectively use carbohydrates. That is then confused with carbs are bad.